Thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to be discussing what the city doesn't want you to know about home rule. And if you have questions, feel free to write them down on a card and we'll be sure to address it. We have some snacks and beverages in the back. There's some paper assigned if you want to have emails from us. And in addition, we'll have some handouts later on during the time. Pardon me? Yeah, you can help you go and get a card if you want to fill it out. There's pens and to write stuff down. So, yeah, you can use any form you want. You can use scratch paper. My name is Donna Varney. I'm a longtime resident and I'm the chairman of Small-Town Sedona. I'm joined by Tim Perry, our treasurer. And today what we're going to try and do is first portion we're going to walk through what we are filming. And then once we get done filming, we will shut the camera off and we'll engage in a conversation where you don't feel like you're on film. Most people feel more comfortable that way. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Tim.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Appreciate you being here on this glorious Saturday of ours in Sedona. My name is Tim Perry. I'm the treasurer of Small-Town Sedona. And we're hosting this presentation to give you some of the information that isn't usually talked about with regard to home rule. The discussion, I wouldn't even say one-sided, it's a two-sided discussion. We have two options and these are simple reasons. But there's a lot more thought that goes into that and into understanding this question, which is really the kicker when we talk about how we need to finance our government. What does the state of Arizona actually require the city of Sedona to do? And the answer to that question is that, well, it's actually not a whole lot.
Tim, can you speak up a little bit?
Certainly, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll speak up. So, the last sentence. We're going to look at what state statute actually requires the city to do, as opposed to how a lot of us are accustomed to thinking about what a government does. Now the thing is, Arizona doesn't actually require the city to do a whole lot. We begin with ARS 9271, which sets out the officers we have to have in the city. Not very many of them. We have to have a mayor and council. We have to have a clerk who's also treasurer, city attorney, town marshal or chief of police. And an interesting twist, and we'll encounter other of these as we go along, we have to have a city physician. That's a holdover from the old days of the territorial statute. I actually brought this up with Kirk Christensen. He said, well, we don't have a city physician, but in another statute, it's been amended so that the function has been transferred to the county in effect. So those are our statutory officers. Those of you who are familiar with city operations may notice there's something missing here. ARS 9303 makes it clear that even though we have what is called a council manager form of government, the manager is a may position rather than shall position. And we're going to get into the distinction between shall and may a little more later on. But while the council has the ability to appoint a manager and delegate, it is not absolutely required that they do so. These are some of the things which the council is actually required to do under state statute. And they're surprisingly uncomplicated. We have to have a general plan. We have to do an audit every year. We have to call an election to issue bonds. The one I particularly want to draw your attention to is that cities shall hold hearings on zoning ordinances, shall power, if they have a planning and zoning commission. Planning and zoning commission is not a must-have, it is an optional. We have to have, a board of adjustment, because a board of adjustment fulfills a larger government's function. P of Z is optional. There's also a couple of shall not powers in this statute that are worth looking at. For example, the city shall not hold partisan elections. Even more interesting in regard to that one is ARS 9834, which provides that the city may not enter into discussions with individuals about reducing their rights. Something for us to keep in mind in Sedona, given that the prosecutor's office seems to like plea bargains an awful lot, and the housing department seems to like asking people for deed restrictions an awful lot. 9834, just bearing it in mind. So as you can see, the shall powers of the city, the things it is required to do, are focused on a very different approach to governance and community than what we think of government in our daily lives as doing. This takes us over to the distinction between shall and may, which is the distinction between words, but it is important in law and city functions. Something that city shall do, it must do. Something that it may do is optional. And this is where the wording in 9240 gets really interesting. This is the real meat of what we think of as the city doing. It's, regulating lands, controlling city finances, having a police force. Here we have some more odd ones from the old days still in there. It can prohibit amusements. There's suppressing prostitution in there and creating workhouses. Well, I guess that's the provision that helped set up the homeless camps. There's a lot of this language you can see that deals with the cities shall have the power to build infrastructure and set up public utilities and similar services. There's also a provision in there for making fire regulations, and I think it's important to point out in this community, the state statute explicitly allows the city, in the interest of fire prevention, to prohibit the construction of wood-framed buildings. Not just to regulate, to prohibit. Here we are in Sedona, where so many people talk about fire prevention, and yet we see everything going up new out of OSB and 2x4s. Shall have the power to do. The city has the power to do all these things, but it's not required to do any of them. And then we replicate. Nothing in statute specifies the degree to which the council has to exercise these powers. It's got the range, it's open, but council has great flexibility, and we, the public, have great flexibility in directing the council. 9276 is interesting because it duplicates a lot of the language from the shall have the power to do section of the statute, but this time with the word may involved. So the legislature is doing two very clear things here. It says the city has the power to perform these functions, and the city has the permission to perform these functions. But again, no requirement. And this is the key takeaway from really digging into AR's Title IX and saying what the state requires us to do. The city has the power to create all of these bodies, planning commissions. It can set up public utilities, public services, but it's not required to do any of them. So, now that we've looked at what the city has to do under state law, the question becomes, how do we fund the city's activities? And that brings us to why we're all here today. There are four options to fund Sedona's budget or the budget of any other city in Arizona. The first option is the state expenditure limit. This is what, in theory, we're all supposed to be on. And the history of the expenditure limit is quite simple. Back in 1980, Arizona voters decided that cities were spending too much money. So they passed a constitutional amendment to set a statewide expenditure limit formula. There was a fixed amount at that time that was determined to be a reasonable budget for a city, and the formula was included in the law to adjust that amount depending on increases in inflation and changes in population. That's the expenditure limit. It is supposed to be the standard for Arizona, but a little under 10% of cities in Arizona are running at this right now. For Sedona, our expenditure limit would be $15.4 million. That's the number set by the state. We also have a number of exemptions for another $16.3 million. That would bring the total budget up to $31.7. The exemptions from the expenditure limit should be looked at very carefully. Basically, the rule for exemptions is that if it's derived from non-local revenue, it's not covered by the expenditure limit. And this includes such things as, well, money that you raise by offering debt, although in a perfect world, Sedona never issues another bond again. This is also money covered, and this is important to remember for later on, money raised as investment income. Investment income doesn't count under the expenditure limit, nor do grants or pass-through funds from the federal or state governments. Off the top of my head right now, about $6 million of Sedona's $16 million in exemptions would be going towards payments of its debt service, which is also one of the exemptions, and roughly another 3.5 would be investment income. That would be over and above the 15.4 expenditure limit. There's 3 other options if you don't want to do the expenditure limit. And the first one is called home rule. Home rule is what the city has been operating on, as we all know, for a long-term basis. And home rule is actually very simple and very devious at the same time. Home rule is where the city basically asks the voters to say, you're going to give us a blank check. For the next 4 years, whatever we decide is going to be the city's budget, you approve that in advance as the alternative expenditure limit. In 2018, Sedona's voters reapproved home rule as the alternative expenditure limit. At that time, the city's budget was $48 million. The city would go on to use that home rule vote in 2018 to approve the FY23 budget, the largest in Sedona's history, more than double, at more than $106 million. That's what happens under home rule, which was supposed to be, in statute, a temporary solution rather than a permanent one. Your permanent solution is option number 3, the permanent base adjustment. We talked earlier about the expenditure limit and how the state, or rather the voters of the state in the Constitution set this number back in 1980. The argument can be made for certain cities or conditions that things have changed since 1980. So that's why there's the option to do a permanent base adjustment, which raises that number from 1980 to a new number. That becomes your new base. So you can take that and say, instead of our budget in Sedona's case being capped at $31.7 million, we can decide, okay, we need more, we're going to cap it at 50 or we're going to cap it at 60, but not go all the way to 100. Or, I know this idea is floating around out there too, we could just raise the PBA sky high to 200 or 300 million, and the city and staff wouldn't have to come back to the public for a vote for decades. PBA can be very useful, but it can also backfire spectacularly if done wrong. Clarkdale and Cottonwood are both operating on PBA now. 54% of cities in Arizona, by the way, don't use home rule. Cottonwood and Clarkdale are doing good with their PBA so far because they've set reasonable limits. Mesa, I've heard, set a PBA at about $150 billion. No voter in Mesa is going to have a say in how their government spends for a long time to come. And the 4th option to fund our government is arguably the most democratic of them all. It's the one-time override. We'd in effect be at the expenditure limit, but if we wanted to spend more money this year or any year, the city could in fact send the budget to the voters every year for a one-time override of the expenditure limit. If we wanted to spend $35 million this year, as opposed to 31, we could. If next year there's a project that needs to be done, staff can ask for, well, can we put another $2 or $3 million in the budget to fund this specific project? And that can all be approved via the override process. Sedona's got a lot of options to fund its government, and there's even some more interesting things we're going to talk about later to how we get creative with this budget. But the question is, now that we know what the state requires Sedona to do, and the 4 options we have for funding it, how much does it actually cost to run Sedona? And I want to put on my historian's hat here for a minute and invite you all to consider this. Sedona was founded in 1902. Sedona was not incorporated until 1988, in which time the population of Sedona grew from almost nothing to its present level. All the services, all the institutions we rely on were built up. And during all that time, municipal spending in Sedona was 0, no municipal government. Everything was done through A, the county, and B, through the work of volunteers and volunteer organizations. 4 organizations were the backbone of Sedona in the old days: the library, the Chamber of Commerce, the Arts Center, and the Rotary Clubs. Through these organizations, individuals, not outside professionals, performed all the functions of government. Derek Pfaff was so good as to call Sedona's history anarchy. Really, Derek? Almost 90 years of people living here happily? That's anarchy because you didn't have a city council and staff? Historically, Sedona was run very cheaply. Sedona was incorporated in 1988. By 2008, 30 years later, the budget had reached a level of $17 million. By 2014, the budget had more than doubled to $36 million. Sedona first broke the $50 million budget mark here in 2020. And in 2023, it more than doubled that to $106.3 million. And I may point out that this graph is not adjusted for inflation. These are the raw numbers. If we adjusted it for inflation, this might look a little bit different. And inflation is actually an interesting part of the question here, because Sedona's demographics haven't changed that much in recent decades. You go back and you look at the 1990 community profile for Sedona. Sedona already had 75 to 80% of its current population. Supposedly, we were getting 3 to 3.5 million tourists a year back then, except, as we know now, people are still throwing that number around, but that number isn't correct, because that's visit counts, not visitor counts. Visitor count is about 1.4 million. When you take out all the people who are commuting here or who are residents of the 2 counties in which Sedona is located, the actual number of visitors is 1.1 to 1.2 million. Either they were massively overcounting back then, as we are massively overestimating today, and the number of visitors hasn't changed, or they were right back then and the number of visitors has fallen. I find that implausible as well, but the data doesn't show an increase. Sedona's population peaked in 2008 and has declined about 5% since then. Crime peaked in 2006 and has declined between 30 and 40% since then. Where's the workload? Sedona's getting easier to run, not more difficult, and yet the budgets keep going up and the staff numbers keep going up. 4 years ago, we had a budget number of staff, full-time, 146, and the budget that was just in the process of being approved, 206. 60 positions in 4 years. Who sees something different because of those 60 positions? I ask that question a lot. I mentioned inflation earlier, and inflation's a big part of it, because if you look at this graph, you'll see it in recent years as we've had increasing economic pressure, increasing pandemic response, and more causes of inflation. That's caused Sedona's revenues to go up. And that's fed into this whole spiral. Revenues increase, more projects are decided upon, more staff are hired to complete those projects. The staff want to do more projects, so they initiate more projects. Projects require more staff, and all of this requires more taxes. That's why Sedona's had 2 tax increases in the last 15 years. I don't know how many of you work in retail, but I know what it's like to lose a sale because someone looks at the tax and goes, I'm not paying that. That's the cost that they tell us it requires to run Sedona. And it all comes out of the fact that council and staff have these home rule budgets that they can decide to do whatever they want with. We don't have the change in population to justify it, but here we are. So now that we know the actual budgetary history of Sedona compared to what the state requires us to do, and the changes that have happened recently, I'm going to turn it over to Donna Joy again, because she's been here far longer than I have, and she can talk more intimately about a lot of the issues that have transpired in this city as a result of this home rule approach that we've been taking all these years.
So yeah, I have been here a long time, and been a business owner and seen quite a bit. When we talk about let's why home rule is a bad idea is we have created over the years the ability for private organizations, whether they're nonprofit or whether they're contracted services, to get no bid contracts. A perfect example is the example of the Sedona Chamber of Commerce. They got a no bid contract in 2013 to market Sedona, and the structure was not set up in a government model that is typically run by government agencies. So our public money went to a private organization without the non-competitive bids, without any covenant not to compete, and they kept the assets. So when we look a little further and we say, okay, well, how about contractors? I was under the impression that all contractors put in bids, and based off of that bid is whether or not they got the job. That if it was a local contractor or a state contractor inside the state, everybody could put in a bid. However, that doesn't happen anymore. With the parking garage, what we had is we had a no bid contract, and when questioned, well, wait a minute, how did this particular person or company get this gig? The answer is that if they're approved by the government, they do not need to get a bid. And so we've got repeat service or contractors doing jobs, and the parking garage started out at what, 6 to 9 million, but the first initial budget was 17.5 million, which has a lot of conflicts in there because it gives the staff 10% ability. So 1.7 million they could approve without going to city council. But moving on, we deleted the commissions. The commissions were the backbone for the residents to be involved and engaged. When we removed the commissions, we removed the voice of the residents. Commissions were typically for residents only. They were open meeting. I attended quite a few of them. I really enjoyed a lot of them, especially the ones on the arts, where it allowed the audience to participate just like a city council meeting. However, the city of Sedona decided to vote in what's called work groups, and these work groups are chosen and picked by staff. They're not recorded. There's no paper trail. We don't really know what's happening, and it's the polar opposite of commissions. Commissions were the backbone for residents' involvement. And still, they're the will of the people. If you don't have them involved, the further you push back the residents from being engaged with the city, the less the residents will have a say or understand what the government is doing. Home rule promotes government waste. You're operating unlike a big corporation. A big corporation or even a small mom and pop shop. You have a budget, you know what your limits are, sometimes you have to pivot and change directions if you find that you're having too much scrap, too much waste, you're throwing things away, or your employees are sitting around twiddling their thumbs. You just don't run with the program without adjusting it as needed. Most companies use a system called total quality management. Total quality management is an interactive program that is real-time performance metrics. I started using it in the 1970s in the medical industry, where everyone knew what was expected from them. If something went awry and it wasn't working, we could pivot out of that and not make bad or defective product. We could make good quality product services by watching real-time metrics. The city of Sedona doesn't do that, and because of that, the deficiencies and the inefficiencies are not praised or fixed. No organization is perfect. We always need to continuously improve. It's a circle. We keep on going and going around in the circle, and every time we go around that circle, we try and make the next time better. The community needs on the budget aren't prepared or aren't part of the whole budget system. There's no performance. You know, for the city manager to be able to approve $100,000 without any consent, that's a pretty high item to be able to just approve. For example, when we had Karen Osborne was city manager, she bought lights for the Safe Place to Park, and they are still sitting in inventory. So when we look at that and we say, well, how much did she spend, and where the heck is this warehouse with all this stuff that is unused? Who is doing the material management, and what kind of performances are we looking at there? Because we don't see that at all. I know of no warehouse, I know of no inventory control, and I never heard any discussions about it. The misinformation, if I changed it right, higher taxes, yeah, we want to talk about that, we want to go back one more. Okay, so the one thing that we missed is that the misinformation campaign in Sedona is enormous. During the time of 2014 till the chamber lost their contract, we heard so many false information. The Chamber of Commerce, their composition of members the majority of them were outside the city limits. All they did was market their members. They used the system the state of Arizona puts in place. The state of Arizona has an incredible tourism program. It outlines everything significantly. It tells you that what does it take to qualify. They do not advertise non-tourism businesses. They use our tax dollars to market only tourism businesses. You cannot be in California and get free marketing. So they limit and control that. The city of Sedona did not do that. When we marketed Sedona, we did a flash marketing. It wasn't targeted for tourism only, and their members were listed in everything from real estate, investment, churches, individual people, you name it. It drove them all to that website where they could hire an investor, buy an investment property. We were marketing to STRs, owners, way before STRs were available in Sedona. I could go on this history stuff for a while, so I'll try and keep it short and sweet. 2013, the city council voted to take the bed tax and increase it by 0.5%. They made an agreement with a regional chamber of commerce to get 55% of all city bed tax. And let me repeat it. They made an agreement to get 55% of city bed tax to market their members. When their members were primarily outside the city by 77%, and only 2.7% of their members were actually hotels renting out rooms. What the heck? It got so bad that if you spoke up, you got bullied. You got threatened. I got threatened so many times because I said no, it needs to be in the city, that I actually called the FBI because these people were out of their minds with the threats. And I am serious. No business should ever be afraid to be in their own town. No person in the city of Sedona should be afraid to walk out their front door because somebody is going to threaten them or boycott them. It's terribly unfair. Business is more difficult in Sedona than most other places because we have it tourism related. So the small mom and pop shops have to be quick on their feet to respond to it. And I'm really passionate about this because I lived through it. I moved here, I was in my 30s. I had a child. My husband and I owned businesses in town. We worked hard, we loved it, we loved the place, we loved the people, but we didn't like the bureaucracy that occurred. The higher taxes from the bed tax went, 55% of the bed tax went to the chamber. We had no say, no transparency. When we asked city council, where is this money being spent? We were told to go ask the chamber. Once those dollars left our software program, we had no ability to see how and where they spent the money. That's a critical factor when you're using public money to market Sedona. Then they turned around and they put in a sunset tax in 2017. They raised the sales tax to pay for the infrastructure, to pay for the tourism because we had so much traffic. Then the city council made it was a sunset tax. Then they took it and made it a permanent tax. And that permanent tax still exists today. The small businesses, everyone says, oh, the residents don't pay. The small businesses don't pay. Well, in the hospitality interest retail, we all pay. And even everyone in this room, if you live in a city, well, even if you live outside the city of Sedona, if you use the name Sedona, you're probably getting charged a city sales tax because of the way the laws are written here. When you look at your utilities, your deliveries, your franchise fees, everything you do at your own home is sales tax. When you look at the small businesses, every single thing they do, except for resale, is charged sales tax. So we do contribute. And what the businesses have is they have what's called a lease tax. If they do not own that building and they lease it, they will be charged 3.5%. When you have retail stores that are paying $6,000 to $10,000 to $20,000 a month, it's not a little bit of pennies on the dollar. It's a lot of money that's coming in from our small businesses. I think it's well over $2 million in the lease fees. But don't quote me on that. Could be a little bit less. So moving forward, city council, a lot of misinformation. Everyone says that we vote on the sales tax. We have no vote on the sales tax, no vote on the city bed tax. That is done by city council. Once they're elected, they can do what they choose. So it has led to higher taxes. Our traditions, way back when we moved here, everybody pulled their money together. There was an item called the Sedona Bridal Fair. I don't know if any of you remember it, but the Sedona Bridal Fair was one of those, just one of many. The Sedona Bridal Fair was a grassroots organization that pooled their money together to market and target weddings. They had an annual signature event, and that annual signature event brought in over 1,000 couples to Sedona to pick and choose where they wanted to get married. Well, those type of groups were pushed out. So I forget the year, but a city council person said, we want everything to go to the chamber. Give them the Sedona Bridal Fair to put on. We don't want you to put it on. We want them to put it on. So those small little events we had, small businesses that were manufacturing, they couldn't get their products in and they couldn't get their products out because of the traffic. A lot of them moved to Cottonwood where there's more ability, and some of them just folded. So now we've created a corner where we're tourism or nothing, where before we had a diversified group. So the old tradition where we would go to Uptown and we would have somebody doing karaoke in Sinago Plaza or one of the other events up there went away. The locals were the ones that fed those businesses in Uptown. I know that because we had a business in there, and our primary customer was the locals. And what happened is when the tourists were in town, we all got slammed, and people would call ahead and say, can you have this for me or that for me, because they knew that we were gonna be so doggone busy during certain seasons, but we handled it and everybody worked together for it. Home rule definitely has poor performance by enormously high salary people. When we look at 45 people making more than $100,000 in a city or town where the average median household is 67 or 68,000, that doesn't make any sense. Normally, you try and do an economic engine that provides the proper salary for the residents to live in your community. You don't have a bloated city staff where you've got 2 people working for $35,000 in the same span. They can do, some of them make 2 or 3 or 4 times as much as a household. That's ridiculous. It should be balanced. It shouldn't be one-sided. The city made an economic crisis just like the chamber did when they pitched it. They said, if we don't get tourists, we will lose all of our sales tax. And they went to the hotels, and the hotels had this horrible thing they did to employees, where they made employees sign a document that said that without the increase of the sales tax, their jobs would be jeopardized, and they may not have a job. And I still have the copies that they sent to the city council, begging them to raise the sales tax. I believe I was the only one at that meeting that said, please do not do this. Please do not do this because it affects the small businesses. It affects how the residents shop. The residents were already complaining. I think I had one council person that told me she went to Cottonwood for dinner because restaurants in Sedona were too high. We should all be enjoying our own services that we have here. We should be supporting our small businesses. You know, it's just the staff, when they make a mistake, they go just right past it. If they had real-time metrics in place, they would know right away by that scorecard or by that performance dashboard that, wait, we are having too many repetitive requests for the same documents. How can we improve the system? And they don't do it. They currently have a system that all they have to do is uncheck the back end to eliminate that problem. And they don't. Why? Why is there a distance being kept? Performance metrics is my pet peeve, and I love it. I put it in time, real time in 1979, and I got so much success from it, I couldn't tell you. Line workers were coming up with the most incredible ideas that saved the company millions of dollars, even way back then. So, the arts, let's talk about the arts. We all love the arts. We used to have so many funky little art galleries and so much fun. Well, the gallery owners, with the traffic, they said, I don't want to go to Sedona. When we raised the sales tax, they said, well, I'm just going to have it shipped in to avoid the sales tax. Because the sales tax is not where you purchase it necessarily, but the delivery location in Arizona. And most people don't realize that anymore. So if they come to Sedona and they see something, it is done all the time. They leave, they go to their hotel room or they go somewhere else and they call in an order and have it delivered to their house to avoid the city sales tax. And you can't make this stuff up. It's all recorded in history. You know, the events, we used to have so many events and we used to have so many weddings that what they did is they really enjoyed the area. They brought their friends and families here and they literally would go from uptown to the Hilton and they would come back. So they would have these wedding events that we shared things and we were able to navigate from the city of Sedona to the village of Oak Creek. And a lot of the businesses in the city of Sedona were delivering to the village of Oak Creek was imperative for their business. They had to have it. And when we cut off that with traffic, we actually cut their revenue streams out because, and they added cost to ours also, because those service providers that lived outside Sedona, they wanted to start charging trip charges. They wanted to increase the cost because they were stuck in traffic. Employees didn't want to work at multiple locations. It was very typical in the hospitality industry that we had workers that worked at the Hilton, and then they worked at Poco Diablo, and then they worked at L'Auberge, and they covered all our special events by going from one to the other and doing it as they needed. So we had a lot of flexibility with employees that we also limited. And home rule is because they took that additional amount of money and they marketed the region, not the city, and it wasn't targeted for tourism. They called us NIMBYs. They called us short-sighted. They sued the residents. There's a lot of things that don't make sense. Why would you call your residents NIMBYs? Why would you try and get them to be away from what they came for? We are the heart of Sedona, the residents. They did increase the STRs. They were marketing STRs, and they are marketing STRs today. When you see the tourism, they market people to stay and play, and STRs collect sales tax and bed tax for the city of Sedona. They are a revenue stream for them. And they have been marketed for as long as I can remember, and they are still being marketed today. And I will then turn it over to Tim.
We'll talk real quick about more of the few or spending decisions by the city before we get into talking about how we might do it better. Still working? Yes, it is. This is a big one. What's the biggest source of overspending in Sedona? The Sedona Police Department. We talked earlier about some of the demographic numbers in Sedona's history. Population in Sedona peaked in 2008 and has declined since that time. Crime in Sedona peaked in 2006 and has come down by about 30 to 40% since then. If you look back, and again, remember, tourism has not increased. I realize members of the city council sit up there and say tourism has increased. Show me the evidence. It's been a plateau for 30 plus years. If you go back to 1990, Sedona had a police force of 17 officers. 17 officers to handle a comparable population, higher crime levels, and the same number of tourists. Today, with a reduced police workload, we have an authorized force of 39 officers. I'll put this in another way that I like to compare it, because I found this out when I was doing research on how cities handle this kind of thing. City of Cheyenne, Wyoming recently announced that they were fully staffed for their police force. I looked at the numbers. They have 1.7 officers per 1,000 people. Sedona, population 10,000, 17 officers, same as we had in the old days. And for those who are going to say, well, that's a big city, yes, big cities have proportionally more crime than small towns. Another comparison I'd invite you to consider is, I know there's a number of people in the audience who have experience running businesses. Sedona Police Force has 3 officers and 1 sergeant on duty at any time, 3 shifts a day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You do the math from the perspective of someone running a company and planning out your staffing on how many people you need to cover those shifts. Is it closer to 17, or is it closer to 39? And the thing is, they're not even good at trying to justify this increase. Every year, the council gives Police Chief Stephanie Foley the opportunity. Now, Chief, is crime going up? Are we seeing more problems? Are we seeing an increase in this or that? And every year she sits there and she goes, no, we're a pretty quiet town, pretty quiet community. I know there's a few rowdy visitors or couples getting in a fight, but that's about it. Now give me my budget and staff increase anyway. I encourage everyone in this room to go back and watch the city council meeting footage from last April, where Stephanie Foley was making her plea that she needed a 30% increase in her staff size. And what she put up on the screen was a graph that showed not her staff graphed against DUIs or arrests or assaults or any other performance metric. She put up a graph that showed her staff compared to all of the other city staff. And she told the council that she needed more people because her department hadn't grown to the same extent as the rest of the city. It was the single most bureaucratic thing I'd seen in a small town in over 20 years of following government. There is no justification for what they're doing, and it's starting to cause us problems now, because now we have people turning up at city council meetings complaining about police brutality. Now we have embarrassing videos in Uptown, and don't forget these are the same people who brought us the flock camera system. All because we've got all of these people on the city's payroll sitting around out of proportion to our needs. Now, what would it cost to actually run the police department on something like a reasonable budget in the old days? Well, 17 people, if you're paying them $80,000 apiece, that's $1.35 million on your salaries. Money for gas, for admin expenses, and they've got a lot more cars than they need that would carry them over for a few years. You could easily run a historically accurate Sedona police force on a $2 million budget. Or there's even other options. I was interested to find out when I was doing the research and finding out about more about home rule, that 13% of cities and towns in Arizona either have no police force or contracted out to another agency. That is another possibility for cost savings, which the city could well explore, and indeed, the city attorney has admitted they've had these discussions, just in case. Here's another department that I've been hearing a lot about this week, another city field of endeavor, we'll call it. The city keeps buying land because it wants to take it out of the housing market. 2411, 89A, the cultural park, all this land down by the creek. And now we keep hearing more and more from councilors again as they run for re-election that, well, we want to buy land to preserve it. By preserve, you mean you want to engage as a government institution in the private real estate market to take out of circulation land on which we, who face a housing shortage, could otherwise build housing. Either because you think that some fantasy of protecting the creek is more important than people's lives, or because there's actually no intention to build housing here. If they didn't have the home rule budgets, they couldn't do this. Environmental destruction. Forest Road, $17 million in blowing up the rocks and concrete and asphalt, funded by home rule. How environmentally friendly is that? How environmentally friendly are the city's home rule funded transit system shuttles that put out, I think the latest numbers are between 2 and 3 times as many emissions as the cars they supposedly replace? These shuttles, by the way, we should remember that the reason we got them was not to serve us, the public, but because the city's transit manager wanted to get a federal grant. He was very clear about that. We talked a bit about this already, but I think it's very important to remember that home rule does not give us anything we actually need. Why do we need all these projects? Why do we need all this construction? Why do we need 200 staff? That's not small town. Small town is about talking about the virtues of smallness. Small is beautiful. Minimal is beautiful. Why should we build 2 roads for 2 different kinds of traffic? Why is 1 road not enough? Why should we build bridges instead of low water crossings? Why do we need to elaborately restore the cultural park instead of keeping it a park? There really is a need in Sedona right now for a revival of interest in remembering what it means to be a rural Western American. And big city budgets that fund a lot of staff and a lot of plastic projects do not contribute to that. I'm going to touch one final thing here, which is that home rule is anti-democratic, or at least let's say it's the least democratic of all options. Because even with a PBA that's got a big amount attached to it, you're still voting for an amount. Council and staff would still be going to you and asking and saying, okay, here's something fixed for you to vote on. Home rule, blank check. We get whatever we want out of it. PBA offers a much better way, overrides offer a much better way, and the expenditure limit offers a much better way, all from the perspective of democracy. Because the expenditure limit was democratically instituted. PBAs are democratically passed and updated. And the override is the most democratic option of all, because it's the old-fashioned, we're going to have an election every year approach. Let's take a look around the rest at how some of our contemporaries are funding their cities. These are figures from the FY26 budget for Sedona. I've used the 26 figures on all of these for comparisons, since some of these bodies didn't have their 26 budgets prepared yet. Sedona, we were at 103 million budget, 202 employees last year, population approximately 10,000. Our budget per resident at over $10,000 and our budget per employee at over $500,000. Here's a few towns from elsewhere in Arizona that might be interested to consider. Snowflake, they only got 25 million budget and 63 employees. Their population's a little bit smaller, but not out of the ballpark. They're still in the same category as us. Winslow, closer to our population, a lot more employees, but only a $31 million budget. What Sedona would have to run under if it was to go back to the expenditure limit. Budget per resident is a mere 3,700. And down in Chino Valley, they've got way more people than we do, but they're running on half our budget with fewer employees. And again, we see a budget per resident figure in the range of $3,000. Let's look at a couple other states. Delta, Colorado, 53 million budget, population almost identical to Sedona's. And so, of course, their budget per resident is down to about half ours. Fruta, population 14,000, and they have their budget per resident down to under 2,000. 28 million to run a city 40% bigger than Sedona. Call it efficiency. And Socorro, New Mexico, 25 million budget. Again, almost the same population as Sedona, and about as many employees as we have. Two things come out of looking at these comparisons. One, you see this figure of around $3,100 of budget, or rather in the range of $3,000 budget per person, is a reasonable budgetary amount for a small rural western town. You also see that a lot of these towns, even while they have lower budgets, don't necessarily have that many fewer staff than Sedona does. I've been quite honest. I'd love to see a bunch of these people fired. I don't know if any of them do. That's a common sentiment in the community. Probably there's a plurality view here I've found that, as one comment in the budget survey put it, police protect the community, Parks and Rec puts on good events. I don't know what the other 150 of you people do. However, it's possible to run a small town with a high number of staff. So it is certainly possible that we could go back even to the expenditure limit, and not very many people would even get fired. It's simply a question of efficiency and approach, and of not forgetting that a lot of the city's spending is not in operations, but in capital projects. So, what paths do we have forward without home rule? We could just go back to the expenditure limit. I have to admit that's probably the one that appeals to me the most. It's simple, it's effective, it's democratic. Some say it might be a challenge to go to that small a budget. Well, isn't that a good kind of challenge? Shouldn't we want to challenge ourselves to be more efficient? The second option would be to go back to a PBA with a one-time override. We'd have to do it in that way because the city is currently funded under home rule through June of next year. We would have to do a one-time override in May to approve an increased budget for the oncoming year because of the way the PBA rules are set up. So if we wanted to do that, we could do that. And then it would be possible to, in that time period, to decide on a reasonable PBA amount. One suggestion I've heard put forward this season, and it's not a bad suggestion, is that we should have a PBA that limits our expenditures to our revenues. That sounds fairly sensible. You could even probably write the language so that it would say that, and you wouldn't have to change it every year. Or we could go to one-time overrides every year. And there's a lot of appeal in that as well, and I've actually heard some support from that in the community this year too. It's the ultimate democratic method for us all to vote on the budget every year. Yes, I'm well aware there's a section of the community that thinks that democracy means, well, you just hand over your willpower to a government official and let them decide for you, but for most of us, that's not a believable explanation. A lot of us here would like more oversight over what the people who work for us do, and annual overrides would give us that ability. Let's take a look at what Sedona's budget might look like if we were to go back to home rule as an experiment. Could we fit everything people want in a 15.4 million discretionary limit plus exemptions? Our statutory officers we have, they cost us $665,000 more or less. The sewage plant we have to have right now, because of the extremely screwed up way in which Sedona's sewage plant was built. There's a consent decree with ADEC and administrative regulations from NACOG and a bunch of other stuff involved. We can't just get rid of the sewage plant even if we want to, so we have to include $4.2 million a year for operation of that, plus I've built in here an additional $500,000 a year to figure out how at one point we're going to replace or get rid of it, because that question has to be considered down the road with the sewage plant. Parks and Recreation, $1.5 million, and I'd like to make it clear that all of these numbers are from the FY26 city budget without reduction. These are what the city is currently spending on these services. Community pool, almost 600,000, special events at almost 500. We have the recreation programs in there at 315, small grants program at 350. We also have the arts and culture grants at 200,000, and all of the community contracts at 1.1 million. All of these things, which are what overwhelming majorities of the community want their city to fund, are included in a potential expenditure limit budget. We've got 53,000 in there for elections as well. Payment preservation. I'd like to talk about this number, 1.451 million. I put that in there initially as a placeholder and I ended up leaving it. Because when I went back and I checked the records of what the city budget was, it had in 7.4 or 8.4, some number like that. But then I looked at what they'd actually spent. They budgeted 7 or 8. They spent 1.7 on paving preservation last year. So to drop it to 1.45, you can easily find those efficiencies. They're not actually spending, they pretend to be spending. We have street maintenance in there as well, everyone likes their streets. We have traffic control in there and police at $2 million. As we talked about earlier, $2 million will easily fund a 17-person police force that meets Sedona's demographic needs. $14.7 million for everything that people in this community talk about as what they want for the statutory officers and other functions we're required to have. Melissa Dunn said the other night that going to home rule would mean, oh, it was nothing but police, parks maintenance, and potholes. Well, as you can see from the numbers, there's a lot more in there than those things. And there's even room for expansion, because that number of 14.7 leaves us about 700,000 shy of the 15.4 million discretionary limit. And there's another number I mentioned earlier, investment income. Investment income is additional on top of this. The City of Sedona has about a $90 million portfolio, invested at about 4%, so you can look at about $3.5 million in investment revenue that could be used for additional programs and services beyond this number. Compare that to our revenues. We take in just shy of $67 million a year. That's a $50 million potential surplus. And that leads us to asking, well, what could be some of the interesting things we could do with that surplus if we didn't have home rule? We've already talked somewhat about the taxes, but there's multiple ways we could look at the tax situation. We could just cut 1% off the top of our tax right now, and that would be great for businesses and residents. Or we could do it a little more smartly. We could say, we're not going to cut the taxes just now. We're going to bank this surplus every year. And in 20 years' time, we're going to have an investment portfolio that's bringing us in enough revenue that we could repeal all the taxes and run Sedona off its state shared revenues and its judicious investments. Think of what a magnet that might be for entrepreneurs, for young families, for people who want to build things and make things and do things. Another possibility, which I'm told is illegal, but I'd like to throw it out there anyway, because maybe we can lodge in the legislature, is that we could just take this surplus and cut a check to every resident every year. $50 million surplus is a $5,000 tax rebate for everybody in town. It wouldn't be transferring tourist tax revenue back to residents. You'd have to change the law, but it's an interesting possibility to think about, at any way. There's lots of opportunities we have to fund our government. Which are the 4 options we take? And we have plenty of money to do it with. One thing I've heard thrown around these past couple of weeks as election season heats up is, well, we have all this money coming in, why shouldn't we spend it? My reaction to that is, you have all this money coming in and you don't need to spend it. Why on earth would you spend it? Who in this room was brought up in a household where you can just go out and spend money on something you don't need and can't justify because you haven't? Is that fiscal prudence? Is that sanity for the future? No. And I know there's people in this room who might say, oh, well, it's a government budgeting process, it's different. No. Same principle as balancing your checkbook or drawing up a budget for building a house. It's not beyond the competence of any individual to do. It's not beyond the competence of us to participate in. We can all participate in this budgetary process and keep an eye on the city. So this brings us finally to the end. I'll just run over a few conclusions real quick. Cities in Arizona have wide general powers under state law. They can spend money in a lot of ways. They can set up a lot of programs. But nothing in the law, as far as most of the things we think about as constituting government, specifies how far the city must go. They're given range. They can choose how they use that range. Things that the state actually requires us to do would probably cost about $2 or $3 million a year. Could be even less. You saw the cost for our statutory officers at $665. That space between $2 or $3 million and $106 million, which was the city's biggest ever budget, is purely discretionary, both by city council and staff, and by residents in how residents choose to exercise oversight. Cities have 4 options to fund whatever they choose their budget to be. There's the home rule option, which gives them a blank check. There is the state expenditure limit option, which says we're sticking with what we already decided on, why bother? There's the PBA option, which says we'll take a rational look at what our vision for the next decade or 2 is going to be and decide based on that. And there's the one-time override option, which says we want clear control of our government spending every year. We want to know what our officials are up to, and we want to be able to kind of give feedback via the budget on whether they're doing a good job or not. Home rule is the most anti-democratic of all these methods because there is no check on what the city can do with the final number. We talked about these numbers earlier. In one cycle, from 48 million to 106, because the voters handed over the approval in advance. Opening drives up taxes. He takes young people away from our communities as they can't afford to live here and can't find jobs. It makes it much, much harder to build housing. We have police scandals now because we have all these police officers running around. We have the city buying up land like the city is now a real estate developer. And none of this has to do with small town Western traditions, with making things and doing things. We don't need to go through this process every 4 years. All we need is to figure out a better way forward that doesn't involve simply handing over discretionary authority to a bunch of people who had never even been to Sedona before they were hired to run it. Every year home rule isn't in effect. We could go to the voters for an override, or we could do a PBA. There's lots of options. This is the path forward if we take a no vote on home rule. The override comes one time next year, May. The special election and cover the FY28 budget. June 31st of next year is when the home rule funding that we have currently going through this fiscal year next expires. July, we would hold a primary election for the PBA at whatever amount that was decided on at the time. Or we could just stick with doing overrides every year. That's a conversation for the next year